Hi, I'm Leanpub from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Leanpub podcast, I'll be interviewing Jonathan B. Crossland. Based in Bath, Jonathan is an author, software developer, and creator of the AMMERSE value system. You can follow him on LinkedIn at Jonathan Crossland and check out his website at ammers.org and subscribe to his newsletter at ammers.substack.com. Jonathan is the author of a couple of books on Leanpub, but the one we're talking about today is The Software Developer's Handbook, Volume 1. In the book, Jonathan provides advice for beginner programmers while it meanders through roles in life to thinking about certain aspects of code. It's not a coding book, it's a how to survive and get better at coding book, but it has code in it too, demonstrating cohesion, coupling, and other aspects. In this interview, we're going to talk about Jonathan's background and career, his professional interests, his book, and at the end, we'll talk about his experience as a writer. So thank you very much, Jonathan, for being on the Leanpub podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story, and I know you've been around, so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you found your way into the career that you've built for yourself.
Yeah, so I was pretty much in the entertainment industry. I think we can successfully say that. I was a DJ and I was an actor in theatre productions when I was in my teenage years. I actually started from 8 years old. Grew up in Cape Town, in South Africa, and yeah, pretty much music and acting and theatre and all that kind of stuff. You'd probably have guessed if you were around me at that time that I would become some sort of theatre director or music director or something, at least in that way. Some of my friends were in theatre, went on to do like soaps, became a soap star and all sorts of things. So for me, I hit a period in my life where I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, so I jumped around quite a lot, really. The music industry in Cape Town wasn't really thriving, so you have to sort of make ends meet. So I did so many things, from welding, bricklaying. I found myself on a building site. Found myself drawing plans for buildings and homes with AutoCAD, stuff like that. And then I found Lisp inside of AutoCAD, just some scripting. And that's really where the computing bug really hit. Before that, I had touched on the traditional things you would, like gaming consoles and the Commodore and the BBC Micro and stuff, just playing around and stuff. But I wasn't a nerd as such. I was more into sport and music and things like that. So it was quite a big leap for me when I found myself in this world, really. So that's how I guess it started. A lot of other little stories in there, but really that's how it started. Yeah.
Yeah, you tell some of the stories in your book very well, which is very, very sort of like interesting tales and a different circuitous path to things, filled with determination along the way, which is an interesting feature of it. And so I'm just looking at your LinkedIn, so you did some formal study of programming a bit?
So, well, yeah, when I finished school, I quit high school to carry on with my music career. I got a music contract offered to me, and got myself out of school at an age that is not deemed acceptable to be leaving school. Just turned 15, and yeah, so that was my life, and that's what I went into. And they were suddenly not around at the headquarters anymore. You go to the office, knock on the door, there's no signs up anymore. Well, the signs were up, but no one was answering anymore. Everyone was gone. And so found myself in a strange position. So I went into a college where you're supposed to catch up with your schoolwork and finish your last few years of school, which I did. And in there's computers and mercantile law and all these other sort of subjects that, you do. But that time it wasn't something that I cared about at all. It was still music, right? So just put myself through to finish school. But when the bug hit, right, in terms of that first scripting, I went down to the local high street where one of the well-known Cape Town University is. And I went in there and I said, look, I'm a student and I've forgotten my papers and I don't know what I need for my assignments and textbooks and whatever else. And a kind old lady said, well, dearie, this is what you need. And she gave me everything. And I picked up things for, 50p for this and 50p for that, secondhand books, ripped pages and all sorts of things. Took it home and I studied. So that my sort of introduction to this has been very much about trying to find my own way in there. Yeah, so I wasn't ever somebody who played by the rules as such, right? So when I was at school and they hand out textbooks at the beginning of the year and have those introductory few days about this and that, meet your teacher and stuff like that, I would take all the books home, go through all of them, spend 2, 3 days going through as much as I can, go back, ask questions, and you would be hit with that. Well, we're not there yet. That's not part of the lesson, right? We're not there yet. And by week 2, lost interest. I'd be writing lyrics in my back of my books, and that was it. So, and also my sort of rebellious streak along that. My childhood was full of rebellion, and in that it was all about discovery and learning for myself. Right? It was very much wired into my brain. So when it came to computing, nothing changed. It was, okay, that's where it goes in that register. Great. I'll put that value in that register, and I'll also put it somewhere else, and I'll put it somewhere else, and I'll see what happens next. And, when I learned APIs, when I learned Win32 APIs, especially, there was no books on it, that I could get my hands on. So I would just go and call all the APIs in a sort of just a randomness fashion and learn what they do. So, yeah, so I think that sort of upbringing, that sort of rebellious spirit sort of bled into how I think, how I approach things, and how I learn. So definitely not in the box kind of thinker. So, yeah.
And what was your first job as a programmer like?
So yeah, I remember that well. It's quite a tough one for me because I just taught myself Pascal. And I was talking to some D-based tables, I think it was at the time. Just learned how to read and write some data, and my Pascal was really rough and ready. And a guy gave me a chance, right? He said, "Come in," but it wasn't a chance. It was taking over from another programmer who'd been on a project for 7 years, had built up a civil engineering product, all Pascal. And yeah, it was really difficult, right? Because overwhelming. I didn't know anything about design or how things really worked. I don't know why the guy gave me a job, but he gave me a chance. And I was there for 6 months learning as much as I could, but it didn't work for me. It just wasn't happening. And you go through all that kind of stuff, especially from my background where, I quit school and so for me, there's a lot of, especially in the early days, a lot of sort of, I'm not a professional. I don't know this stuff, but also I'm going to have to work damn hard at this. I'm going to have to work longer. I'm going to have to do it better, right, to prove myself. And so when that was my first job in the civil, and there was Baxter theorems and all these kind of mathematics as well that I had to learn and struggle with, and somehow I did certain things right, which I have no idea to this day how I did. But that's what I think it is. It's that struggle that was my first. But from that first 6 months, straight away, something clicked in that 6 months. And then things clicked from there, and my next job went better, and the next one went better. So I'm very grateful for that first opportunity, although it was just swimming in deep water.
Yeah, no, that's a really great story. And you ended up, so you started out in South Africa, and you were there for quite some time after you began your career. But then you ended up in the UK. How did that come about?
Yeah, so I mean, the UK as a musician was always, get to the UK, right? As a musician, it was always baked in my head. And so I guess, after about 4, 5, 6 years of programming, that sort of just lingered on, and I thought, well, if I'm going to be better at programming, I've got to go where the better programmers are. That's what you think, So yeah, so we made our way here. So yes, so I think South Africa's got a lot of talent. I mean, a really a lot of good raw talent. But it is a place where you make do and you try out, and the formal is not so formal. And there are people that carve a formal route, but it's very slim pickings, right? There's only 200 people that graduate every year from that university, and there's and you've got millions of people, so it's a really slim pickings, I think. So coming here was a good step for me, yeah, because I got exposed to professional coding, and then had to adapt and step up again and step up again. So yeah.
Yeah. Did you move to Bath, or did you move to London, where most people move to first?
Yeah, when we first came over, I actually ended up in a little town called East Grinstead, which some people may know listening. It's a small town. We ended up there because we knew somebody in the area. But then, yes, I went into London, tried to get work there. Did a startup actually at that time. But yeah, since then I've been nearly all over the country. So it's not just been in one spot. Yeah.
Yeah, I always love to talk to people if they've had that experience of moving to London on the podcast, because I did that myself. I came from the wilds of the comparative wilds of Saskatchewan and the Great Plains of North America to London, where all of a sudden there was more opportunity. I mean, it's not the best word, but there really was more opportunity for me in like one corner of London than there was in my entire country. And that's just an experience that I think a lot of people have when they go to a great city like that.
Yeah. It is a wonderful place, but I think the word for me would be daunting. Cape Town is very small, right? It's got a few million people. But it's spread out. It's spread out, and I think when I first got to London, it just was one of absolute, where do I go? What do I do? There's too many people. What's going on? Yeah, it was really sort of a. And I don't think I've got any ADHD or autism or anything like that. Or at least I've never been tested. But it's an overwhelming experience. You know what they must be going through with that noise and everything around you. And so yeah, when I first, it wasn't a pleasant experience for me. It was very daunting. It took me about 4 or 5 months to really sort of ease myself in. So yeah, that's probably just me. Other people excel straight away, but I found it very daunting.
Oh, I've talked. I mean, including when I was living there. I mean, but there's as many experiences of London as an expat as there are expats in London. Everybody's got their own journey that they go through. Did you, just the last question I'll ask you about that, since you brought up music, did you have a favorite music venue in London?
In London, no, not really. There's music everywhere, so
yeah,
it's pretty nice.
Yeah, I grew to really like it was called the LA2, the London Astoria 2 at the time. It turned into the Mean Fiddler after a while, then I think it went back to LA2, but it was this kind of like, it reminded me of the kind of place you'd go to listen to music in Saskatchewan. I think it was like very sticky floors, very dark, so you can't see why it's sticky, and just sort of lots of sweat. And so just before we go on to move on to talk about your book, one thing I wanted to talk to you about was the W3C data sheets project that you worked on, that you talk about in your LinkedIn profile. And I was wondering if you could take a little bit to talk about that. What was the idea? What was all the, I mean, I know it sounds like a lot of work.
Okay. That's interesting. Yeah. So it's a language, declarative language based on CSS, the sort of syntax of CSS, the selector, but you would be selecting as an item in the DOM, but you'd be selecting it to push data in, right? So it's a data manipulation rather than styling manipulation. And so it's got a data DOM rather than a CSS DOM, and so on. And the idea behind it was to raise the sort of level of ease for, okay, so we have to rewind even further than that. I really do believe in the web's low barrier of entry and the sharing of content, right? So that's deep in me. And I love the idea of anyone can put some data together in some HTML, put a style sheet, put it up, and got a website. And anything to make that easy and simple, anything to open that up and expand it to people who otherwise may not do that, to me is a win, right? And the power of the web, I saw it happen. I was there. I saw it happen. We had a little book with everyone's email addresses in. I could open up and get, and the freedom and the power and that you got, the voice that you had. Today it gets drowned out. There's so many voices. But that always stuck with me, that idea. And I love HTML and CSS for that reason. And I always thought JavaScript, I like JavaScript. I'm one of those weirdos, right? So I really do like JavaScript. But I thought, I'm looking at designers and they have this hurdle to get up, this learning curve to get up to JavaScript just to get some data and populate something and so on. Wouldn't it be nice? There's a declarative language that's very similar to CSS where you can say, go and get the data from this URL and apply it here to this HTML. Repeat on this LI, repeat on this div, and just kind of splash the data, right? And so, so I did that language. I tried to pick it up, but it wasn't sexy, I don't think. I think if it was in the very beginning, when HTML and CSS and that, it would have had more potential. But once all these templating and moustache sort of syntax and all these other things, React came in, it wasn't sexy anymore. It's more sexy to go and do React. But I still think there's a place. I've built the interpreter, I've built the parser, and the language kind of works. It's there. It does it. Tried to get some people to lean in from maybe Chrome or one of the browsers or something to put it in. I just didn't have the to be honest, I didn't have the energy or the capability of putting it into the browser. So it's not something that I did. But I still think it's a good idea somewhere down the line.
Yeah, no, it sounds like very inspired, which is, the best ideas. They don't always sort of grip everyone, but that's that
I
kind of inspiration.
I think it would become the true trinity, right? It would be CSS, DSS, and HTML. I think JavaScript is a little bit of an outlier, right? It's the next step, I think. But if I had my way, DSS would be in every browser, and everybody would be able to pull and push data to and from HTML and forms and all that kind of stuff without having to venture into JavaScript. That would be great for designers. But wasn't to be.
That's fair enough. And actually, I said that would be the last question I would ask before we talked about your book, but I actually forgot I wanted to talk to you about AMMERSE. So you've got AMMERSE.org, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that project is about.
Okay, so AMMERSE, in 2000, thereabouts, 2001, I was rejected for a job at an interview because I didn't know I knew a little bit about it, but I didn't care for the Booch method, the rational rows, that sort of stuff, the RUP stuff.
Okay.
And I was in an interview and they were asking me about it, and I was saying, well, I don't think it's the only way to do things. And I don't think, different teams are going to need different methodologies and all that kind of stuff. And my brain was thinking about that. And I thought, well, what the interview prompted me to what would be my way? How do I think? How would it be then? And in those, at that sort of time, Agile was I think the manifesto was shortly around that time as well. And I was also obviously signed that, like everyone. They put a little website up, right? And you can click and put your name. And that sounded more promising, right? So Agile was more promising to the engineering. Remember my rebellious spirit. So it's not, and by the way, to all the listeners, I'm actually pretty much a stickler for engineering these days, proper engineering, right? I'm not a cowboy, but my rebellious spirit remains, and it always keeps me on my toes. So AMMERSE was this idea about, okay, so what would my method be? And like a true object-oriented kind of mentality, like building the domain model, right? Building the object, seeing, well, hang on, what would the abstraction be of this? Or what would the base class be of that? And that sort of abstract thinking and turning it into more and more abstract thinking, it got me to think about, well, is it a methodology for everything, for every team? Just for software? Why is it just for software? What are the axioms? What are the first principles in all these things? So I started, brainstorming all of that over maybe a couple of years. And I there was I forget her name now, but I wish I remembered. It was silly. I should have name dropped there. Not a very good name dropper, but anyway, she had a TED talk about values, and I thought this is it to me. This is what it's about. They value something differently to me. My values are as important as theirs. Their values are as important as mine or anyone else's. But at that point of time, in that position that they're in that ecosystem, in that team, or in that greater educational sphere, whatever their environment is, they value a certain set of values differently to others. And you can be someone who has a value that changes throughout the years, right? As you live, you change. And so it was that sort of idea. So then I went and did a course on behavioral science, a course on organizational values, quickly dissed that because that's just virtue signaling, and sort of like just jumped around a bit of psychology and doing all these different courses and sort of formulated my own idea of a value system. But a value system that you could use against anything. And when I say anything, I literally mean any system, whether it's human or other. And you can start thinking about, but mainly human, and start thinking about the forces in a system, that interaction. So I could look at Dick and Jane, and Dick says, we really need to work out these requirements, right? We need to list them. We need to figure out which ones to do first, prioritize, and go ahead. And Jane says, well, don't you think we need to maybe just try something out for a couple of weeks and take it to some people and just see if they gel with it, if it's something they would enjoy. And then we build the requirements from there. At least we'll be a little bit more on better footing. Now, they're both right. They're both potentially right. And in some scenario, in parallel universes, everyone's right, right? But in that moment, in that ecosystem, in that time, with that product, with that thing, what is the right approach? And what are the values? So to make this shorter, AMMERSE it's basically 7 values that I've identified as being the ontological, the axioms of all values. So trust, honesty, all those things, but also work ethic, commitment, discipline, all these others, all fall within these 7 categories. And then it's a language abstraction so you can communicate about things, about the system, and say, are we trying to be more reachable than solvable, more agile than minimal, and so on. So A in AMMERSE is agile, and M is minimal. You can think of minimal as a parallel to lean kind of thinking. And the point there is that all of these are weights in a set, and you can identify a product and say, or 2 companies and say, what values are they putting forward more than others, and what values are they putting? And you can compare these values and see what things are about. So in a nutshell, it's a point of discussion, collaboration, communication, understanding, and most of all, alignment. Because now, once you've got everybody in the team focused on a particular value at a particular moment in time, then you're all focused towards that goal. So yeah, alignment would be that's the AMMERSE. There's to it. I've created all these methods out of it, and all these things. But yeah, that's the core of it.
Yeah, thanks very much for that really great explanation. And I really like the sort of start of it in like, there's something that you don't like and so you're like, well, in addition to identifying that I don't like it and what I don't like about it, I'm going to make what I think the way things should be, and do the hard work and the research and everything to come up with a kind of coherent approach to things. That's
for me, it's that rebellious spirit, right? That says, one of the first little phrases that I ever came up with, and I think it was in that first 6-month job that I ever had, so a bit of a smart aleck at the same time suffering from not being able to do his job properly, so that's that dual personality, right? But on that one hand, I'm saying, somebody said, well, why do you want to reinvent the wheel here? It's like, well, because it's not round enough, right? And that was always my mentality is I don't take face value of anything. Very paranoid about being taught the wrong thing. and I'll go back, and I'm very quick to admit that, oh, that's a very good path. Maybe I'll go along it more. Tell me more, tell me more. Okay, right, let me go along that path. But if I smell a rat, or if there's any fakery in it, or any sort of virtue signaling, or any kind of assumption or presupposition that doesn't match, I'm off, right? And I'm trying to figure out, why is that premise wrong, right? What's about that? And that's why I wrote the case against estimates, because it's once again just based on a premise, right, that everybody shares and holds. So that's my motivation, I think.
Yeah. For anyone watching or listening, the case against estimates is Jonathan's other sort of recently published book on Leanpub. We have a separate kind of a launch video for that where we talk about that. It was a really great discussion, and we go into some of those ideas a little bit more in depth there. So just moving on to talk about your book. So the book is the Software Developer's Handbook, Volume 1. So we'll talk about the Volume 1 part later. But at first, what was the origin story of this book? And if you could talk a little bit about what inspired you to write it and when it was first written.
Right. So don't think of me egotistical, but it's kind of this idea that I like history. And it's not necessarily my history from that point of view, but just history. And Grady Booch is collecting all the different people's names in computing, and there's a good website that he's put together. And reading that, and I'm reading lots of stories and lots of people, and getting biographies of people in computing, and I love it. And I thought, well, mine is a very, very minor fraction, if that. But I think because we are a society of writing stories and telling our story, and it's the cult of the amateur, right? But I thought, I've been doing this for 30 years now. Why can't I write about my experience? There must be some value in my experience in some corner, and then that will serve as a record for others. And I would welcome, and really, I would say anyone in this game right now, do it. Put your book on Leanpub, right? And get your version of history out, because it for me, I mixed it up with a book idea that I had 20 years ago that a real publisher didn't want to publish because it's too personal. That was the spark of the idea was very old, but this was a new sort of take on it. But I wanted it to be personal. I wanted to tell an anecdote if it needed one, or if I thought I wanted to. Why not? Right? I hate these dry books, right? I think learning is more about facts and also about the holistic, the understanding of everything. So that's how the book came about, really. And I had a gap in between fractional work. I knew something was coming up in 2 months, and I said, well, what am I going to accomplish in 2 months? And I thought, well, that's a perfect time for writing a book. So that's what I did.
Yeah, perfect. And the book is about kind of going through someone's starting out their career as a programmer, and then the course of their career, and I love the anecdotes. We could talk a little bit more about why anecdotes are so useful. Actually, it's funny that a publisher told you they were bad or something like that. I mean, it depends on what you're up to, but I mean, I think anecdotes are particularly very important for learning. Incredibly important for learning, and so you have things from your life in it, but I love, and it's also very well structured in addition to that, where you talk about your career, the code reuse patterns, the framework designer, the team, best practices, technical debt, and software entropy. And I love the fact that software entropy is at the end. Which is very, very interesting, that there's a kind of hermeneutic circle kind of looping around to the beginning. You don't understand why you're being told what you're being told at the beginning until you get to the end, and then you get it. So it's a really great book for that reason. In addition to everything else, one thing I wanted to just to sort of put you on the spot here about it is that one thing you talk about at the end is that the final chapters are about complexity and how to identify and watch out for it. Complexity is a killer to all software. So that sounds to me like a very battle-hardened, 20 years of experience, 30 years of experience kind of observation to make. So I was wondering if you could take a moment to talk a little bit about, in software, what complexity is and why it's a killer.
Okay, so the anecdote first. So I think, when I started coding, you learn from books that most people when I started at the same time learn from books. Books are incredibly referential, declarative. Here's the call, this is how you do it, here's a small snippet of how you do it, done. We can go to any book, and I somebody on my LinkedIn recently was code reviewing code from books. Very unfair, isn't it? Because the code from books is just proving a point, showing you something. But in the first few years of learning that way, or even videos today, when you're watching somebody just doing something without really explaining, but they're just doing a function, or they're, in a certain way of coding that doesn't align to a professional product. It's not production code, it's book code, it's sample code, or it's YouTube video tutorial code, or whatever it is. There's a huge gap between that kind of code and the code you need to run a proper product with a proper team, building software, dealing with complexity and all of that. And that lesson is something that a lot of people, I discovered anyway, when I started my own software house, and I would hire developers coming in. People got 10 years experience, 15, 8, 3. It was a very common thing to still not have digested how complex things can get. And so, yeah, in the book, I'm just trying to mention it early, right? I'm just trying to get it in there. In terms of what complexity is and how that works, okay, so the part one in terms of sample code is kind of an entry point, just trying to explain that if you're coming from that direction, then you don't have the tools to cope, right? If you're coming from academia, I don't think you've got the tools to cope either. Because in that way, you're dealing with some good stuff, right? Data structures, very important. Everything's about data structures, right? Everything's about messaging. So you're learning the basics, absolute. But one thing that I've noticed is they jump onto frameworks extremely quickly, more than anyone I've ever seen. React, Python library this, Python dependency that. In the teams that I've had, and this could be subjective, everyone needs to go and evaluate it for themselves. But in my world, in the people that I've seen, the people that I've hired, the people that I've worked with, I started to notice a sort of a pulling apart where the academic side was trying to do proper engineering in a proper way, but was still lacking dealing with the greater complexity, and were very much influenced by frameworks and using dependencies and stuff like that. And the people that were taught from books had no idea about the complexity or the data structures and getting lost as well. And so for me, it was, well, how do I teach this to people if you start? What would I go back and tell myself? Now, my journey was very different to what I remember everyone around me, their journeys were. People were very good at writing a class and a function and getting the app together and building a screen, a Windows form or something like that. And I'd look in the back and I would just see if statements, the snake of if statements. And I would see that everywhere. And that annoyed me, and it didn't seem to annoy too many others as much as it annoyed me. It was something that they thought, well, that's how it works. Oh, I'll get to it, or I'll do this. For me, it was burning. If I wrote a single line again, if I knew, I'm a very pattern-oriented guy. If I maybe it's the music in me or something, right? But it's all patterns. The second I wrote something that resembled something I had written before, I'd be hunting it down and sorting it out. I had such a high bar for reuse, and those around me didn't. And I think today, if we fast forward now and we just go to today and look at what complexity is, we are using, and I'll give you 3 tracks. One, we're using the same kinds of languages that we had in the 80s and 90s. I know new languages come about, but the fundamental structure of these languages, the imperative nature of them and how we go about building things is relatively the same. OO is what, from the 60s, 70s, right? So same paradigms, functionals even earlier. Like we've got the same stuff. Yet we're trying to build the entire banking system on it. the tools that we've developed is not strong enough. It's not tall enough to deal with the complexities that we've got. Everything is too imperative. I think declarative is in our future, in our industry's future, and it has to be. Even with AI, I'm pretty sure declarative is the next declarative language, the next killer thing to raise that abstraction. So I think we're just all trying to do the best we can with tools that weren't designed for this. And I often kid, like, are we willing to build the Star Trek Enterprise with React? I wouldn't want to.
No.
So I think complexity is just something we've I think we hit a wall in that levels of abstraction, and we've been tinkering around, improving where we are, doing different things in different ways, but never really going upwards. So that's where I think the real complexity is. And yeah, my final point on that was, just as an example, you take coupling and you say, well, okay, people are talking about coupling and decoupling, and we've got all these patterns and all of this. The reality is it still gets linked into the compiler, and there it is. There is no detachment, right? It's levels of decoupling, right? It's not just coupled, decoupled. There are levels of coupling, and I think it's just those sorts of things that we've got youngsters in the industry, right? The pyramid, us at the top, the old boys, the ones at the bottom, young. They haven't learned those lessons yet. They're using the same tools, but yet I feel sorry for them, because I say that for them, but I'm still coding, right? But I feel sorry for us that we're still building, stuff in the same old tools. All those things like case tools and code gen and that sort of stuff. And that's why I'm actually quite eager for AI, to be honest. I'm actually quite positive about it, because I think if we can't get a handle on this level of complexity, at least we'll have some help, hopefully, once it gets better.
Yes, definitely. Well, and on that really great note, I love anchoring it in history that way too, right? Like we are still to some extent at the beginning of programming as a human activity. I mean, we've been doing computer, the people who know the history know that, the reason there's 80 characters go back to in a line of code, typically go back to the French looms and stuff like that. So there's been versions of programming that have been going on for a long time, but computer programming is pretty much, let's start it at World War II, what we would recognize now as kind of computer programming or something like that. And we're still at the beginning of the journey, very close. It's kind of like, you imagine 80 years after they discovered germs, where would medicine be? Right. And it's very interesting to see these sort of levels of reflection happening on the practice, and how we're building our world on top of this, though. So in the last part of the interview, I really like to talk to the guest about their approach as a writer. So one of the things you talk about very movingly at the beginning of the book. So this is like version 2 of a book that you originally published, I think in 2020 or something like that. And you say, it didn't get all that many readers, but like writing is just so important to you that you have to write anyway. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that expresses itself in your life practically. Do you write every day? Do you write between do you get up in the morning and write from 6 to 7 a.m. or do you write at night, or are you more like, I guess, a conventional rock musician or something like that, and sort of write at 3 a.m.?
So yeah, I've got a few books on the go. So one is a children's book. So that I try and put in at least 2,000 words a day. That I'm trying to get. That I've got a routine for. I get up and I read the last chapter, or at least the last sort of few pages of the chapter, just to get my head back in. And then I'm a pantser, so I write. I've got a sort of very vague idea of where I'm going, but I let the story reveal itself to me. That's how I write. When it comes to this kind of stuff, I'm sort of a mind stream writer, if there's a word for that. I don't know if that's a real term, but it's a mind dump, right? So I like Bertrand Russell's style, of writing. He's sitting at a table and he tells you what's going on. It's just a stream of consciousness. So all of my books are very much like that. I get into a flow, and then sounds stupid, but I let the universe tell me what's going to come out. Or it just comes out. My brain puts it out. That's how it starts. So to me, I don't need to have a strict routine, but if I have no routine, then I can't get into a flow. So I do need some kind of routine within a reasonable amount of error, right, margin, just to kind of say, okay, now's the time. It also helps the household so that this is my time, close the door, that sort of thing. But yeah, I can find myself writing, on the couch watching a movie. I'll find myself, I didn't watch that whole movie because I've just written a chapter, right, on my phone. I think writing is just something that I have to do. So yeah.
That's very well said. And I like the idea of sort of needing some kind of routine to get into flow. That's a very well expressed thing. I've heard other people put differently. And this book is now called Volume 1. What is your plan for Volume 2, and how many volumes are you planning?
Okay, so I'm planning 4. Number 2 is about 50%, I would say there. It's been outlined. I've outlined 3 and 4 as well, but I learned, it's very rough. I've learned that I change it as I go, so things will modify. The idea is to just sort of block off phases of my career. So there might be a sneaky Volume 5, right? Because who knows what's going to happen. But in terms of my career so far, I've divided it up into 4 parts. And I'm trying to tell the story of that first 1 to 5 years, then the 6 to the 11 or 12, and so on. Just grab them in snippets and reiterate some lessons in different ways with different anecdotes. But importantly, as I've grown, I'm growing with the book. I'm having the book grow with me. So this Volume 1 is very much my memory of how I thought then, with a little bit of now wisdom to make sure that I'm not saying the wrong thing. But the stories are real from then. And every volume will be stories that are correct in that. So the final book will be, the last 2 CTO roles that I've done. One where I got screwed over royally. One where, and so on. So, you learn different things at different phases of your life. And as a CTO, I've got just as important lessons to share about that side of things as well. So this is going to be a coding book through how I go along. Yeah. So there might be a Volume 5. It depends whether I give it all up to get into bonsai or not.
Right. That's a really great idea, starting it out of sort of mapping the volumes to your career, and sort of, so what would the first volume be? It would be kind of what I wish I'd known when I was at that stage. And then having you sort of like, even political, but by the end, it's kind of like high politics and, business as a CTO or something like that. That's just really fantastic. And still coding, as you said. The last question I always like to ask on the podcast, if the guest is a Leanpub author, is, and I know you've been using our upload writing mode, but if there was one thing when you're using Leanpub that has you shaking your fist going, damn you, Leanpub, why does this suck so bad, that you could ask us to fix? Or if there was one magical feature you could ask us to build for you. What's that?
I'll tell you privately.
Oh, okay.
Look, it's nice to have a platform out there, right? That I think this age that we're in, this fractional work, this AI augmentation, possibly job removal, the cult of the amateur, all that kind of stuff. It is extremely important to have a platform where writers can be writers and just publish. And I think gatekeeping is one of the largest problems in the world, in whatever industry, but it is prevalent in the publishing industry. Gatekeeping is something that we have to fight. Sorry, it's the rebel in me again, but it has to be. We have to hear, I don't mind a book that somebody, put together and the grammar's not 100%, it needs to be edited. To me, I don't mind, right? If the story is good and it needs to be told, tell it. And I think there's too much of this kind of like, no gatekeeping, like, well, I was told no anecdotes, please, in that book, it's just the information, and that is gatekeeping of another kind, a more subtle kind, but it changes the landscape. It reduces creativity, it reduces voices, and I'm not for it. So Leanpub, number one, you have a vision and a goal that aligns with that thinking that must continue. It just has to. In terms of like what I would change, I would say I think your menu needs a bit of work. The overall navigation, you know.
Yeah, thanks very much for saying that. I mean, I couldn't agree more. That was very eloquently put about the importance of sort of having platforms that aren't gatekeepers, but allow people to express themselves and to the whole world. I mean, that is a big part of our mission. Yes, we're actually working on what we call D3, which is a redesign of the entire website and the menu navigation stuff. I'm not promising it's going to meet anybody's particular interests or tastes, but currently right now, like there's a couple of just sort of we always try and iterate and we always try and make it better, but there's some funny navigation problems that leave people lost. And sometimes, if they've had a few drinks, kind of their language gets a little bit less professional when they're trying to find something on Leanpub. And we're very aware of that and trying to fix it. Well, Jonathan, the book is Software Developers Handbook, Volume 1. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your evening to talk to me and to talk to all of us about yourself and about your really interesting career and your ideas and about your book.
Thank you very much for having me. This is great. Yeah.